Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for those introductory remarks, Xiaofei. My name is Shepard. I'm editor-in-chief of the GW Collegiate Journal of Chinese Affairs, and I also help run the research team here at GW. At first, I think when I was thinking about hosting an academic conference on domestic Chinese politics on a balmy spring Friday morning, I was a little bit worried about the kind of attendance we would get, but rest assured at GW, there are also a lot of people like me that are just absolutely gripped by Chinese elite politics and domestic patterns in the People's Republic of China. So I'm really pleased to see so many familiar and new faces here to join us at our spring conference. As Xiaofei alluded to in her introductory remarks today, over the course of this conversation, I think we'll be hoping to touch on something that I think for a lot of people in the West who perhaps don't know a great deal about Chinese politics is a real paradox of the political system in China, which is that as CCP being the singular governing institution within the country, that they have to respond to the interests of these very different disparate interests and constituent groups within the country. For example, within the CCP membership, you will see financiers, entrepreneurs, capitalists, while at the same time, you will see rural workers, laborers, those within farming communities or those working in state-owned industries. And so I think for a lot of people in the West, the paradox is, well, how does the party respond to all these different interests? And what are some of the tensions and fissures that come along with that? Well, to have this conversation with us today, we have two terrific speakers, and I'll just provide a little bit of a greater introduction about some of their research background. On my immediate left, we have Professor Martin King Whyte, who is the Emeritus John Zwangstra Professor of International Studies and Sociology at Harvard University. He does, however, have a connection to GW. Prior to moving to Cambridge in 2000, you taught here for 6 years, from 1994 to 2000. Before that, had a very long teaching career at the University of Michigan. I think it's fair to say that you've had a great deal of different research interests over your career, including rural, urban life, dating trends, family trends within both the People's Republic of China and in the United States. But I think it also would be fair to say that in terms of the past 2 decades, you've become especially famous for your pioneering usage of sociological survey data research within China, asking those within China how they respond to these widening trends of inequality within the country. You first had a nationwide survey in 2004, which was the subject of your 2010 book, The Myth of the Social Volcano, and then you replicated that nationwide survey again in 2009 and 2014. And certainly that'll be a great deal of our conversation today to see some of these differing trends in public opinion in China responding to these structural level changes in the economy. On the left of Martin King Whyte, we have Professor Bruce J. Dickson, who is our own professor of political science here at George Washington University. If you've taken any one of Bruce Dickson's classes here, you will know that he is a very proud alumnus of the University of Michigan, which he makes known at pretty much any opportunity possible. So I'm actually preempting him at this opportunity. This is actually another one of the funny connections between our two panelists. If it's not too embarrassing, I would like to reveal that Professor Dickson actually met his future wife at Martin King Whyte's seminar when he was at the University of Michigan, which I think is pretty extraordinary. So hopefully this is like a pleasant reunion of sorts here at this academic conference. But talking about your research background, I think it's fair to say over your career, the primary question that you've been really interested in is, in this new reform and opening up landscape, how is the party managing its relationship with society? And you look at many different facets of that question. And I think in particular, I think it'd also be fair to say that you've really focused on the relationship between the party and the private sector and the business community. You've published a number of full-length books on this, Red Capitalists originally with Cambridge, and then eventually you had with Harvard University Press Allies of the State, which was included a 2000 survey of different entrepreneurs in China, asking them their thoughts on the party, some of these broader changes in the economy, getting their opinions on these swings in the country, all of which we will be discussing at length in this conversation, and seeing from your initial surveys back in the 2000s and the 2010s, what things have changed in China? How have opinions changed? What has changed in terms of the government's policy regimen to address these things? So we all hope to get onto that in this conversation. So I think this now raises the question, well, what is the best way to jump into this really meaty conversation with many different possible avenues? Professor Dickson, I think the first thing that I wanted to ask you to begin this conversation, because I think there's going to be people in the audience who perhaps don't have the same level of background with domestic Chinese politics. I think it might be useful to start a conversation by starting to tease out some of these differences between the Chinese Communist Party and other political organizations and parties that perhaps we're more familiar with in the West, in liberal democracies. I think when people think of political parties here in the West, we often think of, well, there's clearly like a core constituent group within each party. Just to give an example off the top of my head, in the UK, in the Labour Party, you often associate that with trade unionists. Would you say there is an analogous core constituent group that really underpins the foundation of CCP support? I know you've written about this so-called three revolutionary classes of workers, farmers, and soldiers that traditionally back in the incipient years of CCP really formed an underpinning of the support. But would you still say those are the core members of the CCP support today? And how would you characterize how the CCP manages its relationship with its membership role?
That's a big, broad question, so I'll try to break it down and get started on it. So traditionally, the party's main focus, as you said, was on these three revolutionary classes, when it was a more traditional Marxist-Leninist organization that recruited people that were seen as being the appropriate class background for a communist party. So workers, farmers, soldiers. That was true for most of the Maoist period, but as we moved into the post-Mao period of economic reform, those revolutionary classes were less relevant for the party's agenda. And so throughout the party's history, as the agenda of the leadership changed, the recruitment strategy also changed. And so in the post-Mao period, when you're looking at economic reform, they're looking to both for members of the party, as well as people they appoint to party government positions at all levels of the political system. They're looking for people with the type of backgrounds necessary for achieving rapid economic growth. So they shifted away from recruiting workers and farmers, and now very little recruitment is done, especially in the countryside. Very little recruitment is done. Most of the people that they would want to recruit have migrated to the cities. So anyone of ambition and skill has, for the most part, left the villages in search of work elsewhere. Instead, what they focused on now is the urban middle class, so the people who have the better educated part of the population, white collar jobs, the blue collar jobs. The main source of new party members for the past couple of decades really has been college students, whereas in the past the party would not do much recruiting on college campuses. They thought they were too young. They hadn't established a record yet. They hadn't had much in the way of accomplishments to distinguish who should and should not be in the party. How loyal they would be had fully been teased out yet. But in the wake of the '89 demonstrations, it was clear the party had to be better embedded on college campuses. Better understanding of what students were thinking, because most protest movements begin on college campuses. So beginning in the 1990s to the present, college students have been the main source of new members for the party, and in general, an increasing share of the party membership has what we consider to be urban middle class, not the traditional social groups that we would rely on.
I think some of the things that you got into is some of these recent trends in party membership in the reform and opening period. Before we spend a lot more time discussing those, I think it would be useful to just linger a little bit longer about the Mao era and discuss how the party actually did on its governing record in trying to govern on behalf of these more core traditional constituent groups, like you were mentioning at the beginning, such as workers, soldiers, and farmers in particular, which I know, Professor Whyte, you actually have written a great deal about. You're famous for characterizing the Mao era rural policy as that of socialist serfdom, which I think for many people would like to understand a bit more what you mean by that, if you mind elaborating.
Sure. First, I'd like to say I'm glad to be back here at GW. Dylan didn't mention it, but even though I'm emeritus from Harvard, I'm also back teaching a course once a week here at GW that Dylan is in. Jack Albert, I see. Maybe there's some, I don't know if anybody else. I have a master's level course in the Elliott School on Contemporary Chinese Society. It meets once a week. And in order to facilitate this, David Shambaugh left me his office and fled to the West Coast where he's having a sabbatical at Stanford. So I'm enjoying, at least for a brief time, being back and teaching GW students again. In terms of social circle, the whole question about the ironies and paradoxes and perniciousness of rural-urban relations and the treatment of the peasants in China is something that I could go on for 2 hours about if you get me riled up, and I won't do that. But I will just simply say that anybody who knows anything about Chinese history knows that the Chinese communists claimed that in imperial China there was a feudal system in the countryside. It's bunk. The Chinese rural relations were nothing like feudalism. And in particular, people were not bound, farmers were not bound to the soil. You could buy and sell land, you could change and go into commerce, you could go to the cities, and of course you could go overseas. So you have Chinese going all over the world. And Mao, of course, came from a rural background. He came to power in a revolution by mobilizing a mostly peasant army to take over the country in 1949. And in the early 1950s, there were a lot of opportunities for the people from the countryside, ambitious young people in particular, to go into the cities and get jobs in the middle order. But after the 1950s and the socialist transformation, and particularly the imposition of the communist system and the development of the hukou system with migration restrictions, basically from 1960 onward, you have something that looks much more like feudalism, although of course the Chinese Communist Party would not call it that. But basically, commune members were almost all of them bound to the soil. They could not decide, hey, I'd like to go to Beijing, and I'd like to go overseas. I'd like to leave farming and do something else. Women could move into their husband's village, as they had done traditionally. But other than that, except unless you were admitted into the army or you were one of those rare rural youths that got far enough in education to get admitted to a university and get okay, almost everybody else was bound to the soil. And at the end of the Mao era, the countryside was basically mired in abject poverty as a result of this. Any agricultural economist knows that one of the best ways to develop in agriculture in villages is to allow people to leave and go elsewhere, to go places where there are more opportunities, and send back remittances and attract other people from the village. But that was essentially blocked off until after Mao died. So really, I mean, it didn't have all the elements of feudalism. You didn't have, I don't know, Chinese knights riding around on horses with jousting with lances or whatever. But nonetheless, this business of the farmers being unable to change their status and being required to engage in agricultural activities, and in a way that essentially produced, low cost food to feed the cities. So there was essentially a severe exploitation of the peasants in the Mao era. It gets partly relieved in the reform era because the migration restrictions are ended, and of course you have migrant laborers and so forth. But the hukou restrictions that required people still to be classified as agricultural in origin have remained right up to the present. So that still today, China, as a sociologist, I would argue that the foremost cleavage, social status differential difference in opportunities in China is between rural versus urban. And compared to others, you know, if you think about American society, well, we have lots of rural poverty, but we have lots of urban poverty. We have equal opportunity poverty, but rural versus urban is not the major axis of any global society today. And it has not been for these generations, but in China, it's still extraordinarily important.
I think that's a really important point you made about indicating only somewhat of a partial reform from a lot of these more entrenched positions within the Chinese Communist Party's history. But nevertheless, I think as Professor Dickson was indicating in his first response, obviously a great amount of things have changed, both in terms of how the party governs on behalf of rural policy, but also in terms of the kind of membership within the party itself. I think many people in the audience will be familiar with the three represents policy later enshrined in the party's constitution from the Jiang Zemin era that welcomed a lot of formerly marginalized groups that were excluded from participating in the party, namely entrepreneurs, businessmen, capitalists, certain academics that were then welcomed into the fold. And a question I was curious to ask you, Professor Dickson, was, you know, at that time of these great changes, how did the senior leadership trying to reconcile these new members within the party to conservatives that were entrenched in the CCP that perhaps were not used to these changes from when they were leaders in the party? And just sort of a follow-up question on that, I would be curious to know, as a result of these new kinds of voices within the party, how did that affect both the position of the party itself and also the position of these businessmen, these red capitalists that you write about that joined the party? Did you find in your research that as a result of businessmen joining, that they became successfully co-opted by the party and shifted more closer to government policy? Or as these businessmen come into the party, did the party start shifting more towards pro-business opinion when they started joining in the 2000s?
Yeah, the shift or the tension within the party about having capitalists in the Communist Party began in the 1980s when the private sector began to reemerge again, and the question was, to what extent should the party be encouraging it? Should it be trying to co-opt successful business people into it? Through the 90s, through the Jiang Zemin eras, it tended to be a very controversial issue between the more traditional conservative ideologues who saw capitalists as being, in contrast to the three revolutionary classes, capitalists were class enemies. The Communist Revolution was fought to get rid of capitalism in China and other countries that had communist revolutions. So the idea of welcoming them into the political system, supporting them, promoting them, just was anathema to the more conservative ideologues. But ideology didn't matter too much in this period. It's much more about the pragmatic approach to economic development, and almost all economic development, economic growth is happening in the private sector. The state-owned enterprises have been running at deficits, running up huge debts for decades, and that hasn't changed. So the new growth, the new job creation, new tax revenue for the state was all happening in the private sector. Local officials who needed to grow the economy in order to get promoted, therefore were in this quandary. They weren't officially able to recruit them in and have any kind of official relationship with them, but they needed their support in order to grow the economies for their own career benefits. So they found ways around the ban on recruiting capitalists by saying, well, they're not really capitalists, they're head of a collective enterprise. And at some point, they just realized it was getting a little bit silly. They had to have reality catch up with the practice. So they came up with this three represents policy as an ideological justification to do what they were already doing. So this didn't really open the door. It was a way of legitimizing the practice that had been going on for 10 or 15 years. And so when the three represents becomes the official policy, it became easier to recruit entrepreneurs into the party But as best we can tell, it didn't lead to a huge increase of capitalists joining the Communist Party, because the ones who want to join already did. Plenty of private entrepreneurs want more of an arm's length relationship with the party, so the party's not meddling in their affairs too much. For the ones who were either recruited into the party or were given official positions, even in local people's congresses, local legislatures, or the parallel group, the People's Political Consultative Conference, which is this advisory body that meets alongside the people's congresses. These sort of honorary positions that give select private entrepreneurs some status, and because they have this official status, it also gives them access to bureaucrats on a regular basis. Where if you're simply having a business, it may be difficult to get a meeting to promote your business interests, to get licenses for exporting, for being able to expand your business or get new loans or whatever. But if you have an official position, you can use that position as a way of getting access to officials. Instead of having capitalists in the party trying to change the party, the thought was for a lot of Western observers that as capitalists would join the party, they became more important. They would push political change that would end up leading to democratization. And as best we can tell, that was not part of their agenda at all. People who were willing to be co-opted were really trying to protect their businesses and didn't want to have excessive taxes being taken, money taken out of their firms. They didn't want to be protected against having their property confiscated by the local state. So it's much more about protecting their interests rather than representing the interest of the business community as a whole within the political system. And as a consequence, they haven't had the political role that many people expected. Even less so today, because whereas before the party was promoting the private sector, for the past 4 or 5 years, the party's been somewhere between ambivalent and reactive to the private sector, seeing it as a potential source of that the interest of firms may not align with the party's own agenda, especially as the party's being more focused on national security interests and less on economic growth. The type of firms that used to be held up as exemplars, firms like Alibaba and Tencent, are now being under scrutiny. And so it's a dramatic shift. So whereas even before, private entrepreneurs were not playing a large political role, we're not pushing a political agenda, now even less so, because the party is less hospitable to the private sector, less promoting its interests. Its rhetoric is still pro-private sector, but in practice, there's been an ongoing squeeze against the private sector, especially the online firms and the technology firms that has been the target the party's hired for the past 4 or 5 years.
Going directly off of what you just said, I thought one of the really interesting observations you made in Allies of the State, which was that based off that 2000 survey that you did with, that was eventually co-authored into that book with Chen Jie, is that you found that the reasons for entrepreneurs for actually joining the party was not for financial interest, but actually for political advancement, which I thought was quite interesting. Another reason why I was so excited to get you two together for this event was to begin to bring into conversation some of the different research findings that you found and try to reconcile maybe some of the slightly different results that you found in the survey results that you made in the 2000s. Another one of the findings that you made, Professor Dickson, in that Allies of the State book was one, that these entrepreneurs at the time in 2007 were generally very favorable and positive towards government policy and government stewardship of the economy. And then you also found a little bit more about some of the social background information of what kinds of people were these red capitalists in terms of other salient background features to their identity. You tended to find that they were had higher quality access to education. They were generally coming from more privileged backgrounds. They generally resided in coastal metropolitan areas. And the reason why I highlight this is because a seemingly different result is something that you end up finding in your initial 2004 nationwide survey, Professor Whyte, because, despite the fact that I just mentioned that, these entrepreneurs in 2007 at first were quite positive on the party's record, you found in your 2004 study, Professor Whyte, that actually it tended to be those that were precisely more educated and those that were more urbanite were those that were actually more frustrated and aggrieved with party policy regarding addressing inequality or addressing stewardship of the economy. And so something that I would like to ask you is, could you perhaps explain why, despite them having some of those shared features that you would consider to be more aggrieved members of the Chinese body politic, how come entrepreneurs and, well, more understandably red capitalists were, more positive about the government's stewardship of the economy?
Okay, sure. Thank you for raising that question. And I'll get into a little bit here, but the main thing is entrepreneurs are only a small portion of the privileged urban population, and much of the urban population is not privileged. And so the main findings in my survey it is the case objectively, because there is this huge rural-urban gap in standard of living and in lots of other realms, like even how many babies you can have during the one-child policy era. But when we did this first national survey in 2004, and again, the focus of the survey was asking people how they feel about the fairness or unfairness of current inequalities and the chances for ordinary people to get ahead. And what we found was that the rural respondents, who are at the bottom of the social order in terms of objective characteristics, were more accepting and more positive and more optimistic about their chances of getting ahead than the urban respondents in general. But I should, before going further, say that across all three surveys, again, the title of the book based on the first survey alone was Myth of the Social Volcano. So there were widespread expectations that Chinese people were more and more angry about the unfairness of inequalities, but we didn't find that overall. And we still couldn't find it in 2009, and we still couldn't find it in 2014. But if I have time, we have some new surveys that in 2023, that collaborators in the PRC have carried out that shows that in fact there are more, not social volcanoes, but more negative signs now. But to get back to the 2004 survey, there are two parts of it. The rural people were more optimistic and accepting, and the main feature there is simply the fact that they were so oppressed in this socialist system that lasted until the end of the Mao era, that even though they were still at the bottom of society, but their opportunities for moving ahead, for leaving villages, for becoming migrants, for increasing their family income and so forth, had improved so dramatically that they were, in 2004, still very positive. The other thing that I didn't anticipate was that, that in 2004, this was in the wake of Churumji's reform of the urban economy, the smashing of the iron rice bowl, the massive layoffs, the huge reductions in employment in urban state enterprises and so forth that took place in the late 1990s. So there was still, in 2004, these more negative urban attitudes. A large part of it was that the majority of the urban population, substantially middle and working class and lower class urbanites, their lives were not looking so optimistic. Many of them had been laid off of their jobs. They were scrambling to find new ways to make a living. In the two later surveys, the rural-urban difference in positive attitudes doesn't go away entirely, but it largely shrinks until it's not significant anymore. So by the 2014 survey, urbanites benefited more from the reform since then. The smashing in there and high school is now in the distant rearview mirror. And once again, urbanites have all the advantages and rural people are still struggling, and they've been subjected to layoffs after the world financial crisis, layoffs after COVID, and so forth. So there's, if you like, a more return to a more conventionally expected pattern in which rural people have more to complain about.
Before we go into some of these public survey opinions closer to today, I did want to spend a little bit more time discussing how this business environment has changed and how the state-business relationship has evolved since you initially did that 2000 survey with the Changjie. You were just mentioning earlier that, you know, today you could characterize the relationship between state and business as either, you know, ambivalent in the best case scenario, or perhaps even more repressive in some of these examples. And, you know, one thing that I think a lot of people in the United States are interested in has been this widely reported phenomenon of these golden shares, which is something that for people who went to last year's annual GW conference on China's economic development, is something that Meg Rithmeyer mentioned. These golden shares, for people who aren't familiar, are essentially these Chinese state-owned equity shares that allow the CCP to elect special board members, even in private enterprises. So these are not state-owned enterprises, to give you an idea. And this enables them to have effective veto power over, you know, corporate decisions that necessarily might go against party interests. And I think a lot of watchers in the China sphere, or those within the political science academe, have suggested that perhaps this indicates a shift in the kind of relationship between the party and the private sector. I was hoping, Bruce Dickson, you could go a little bit further and discuss this new regulatory, including this new antitrust environment that the party has been really focusing on with the private sector today. When you compare how the party managed its relationship with the private sector in 2007, what are some of the major changes that you have noticed on your end?
There's been a very definite shift in the party's approach to the private sector and its willingness to either support or manage the private sector. At the most benign level, part of it is just that this is an area that has not been well regulated until recently. And so you have a lot of what we would consider to be monopoly practices that now get companies like Apple in trouble. So imagine if you had a situation where you had an iPhone, and because you had an iPhone and Apple wants to promote its iTunes subscription service, you can't have Spotify on your phone. And there's similar types of practices for ride sharing and other operations in China, where if you have one service, you can't have another. And so because it was a poorly regulated industry, the whole online commerce and other types of tech-based services, the government didn't really understand it. It wasn't well regulated. The founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, gave them a public tongue lashing, saying that they were old-fashioned, didn't know what they were doing. They were getting in the way of companies like his, and they didn't really appreciate that kind of public feedback. And so not long after that is when the crackdown against his company and other tech companies began. So part of it is just an effort to better regulate these emerging sectors so that they are not taking advantage of their large market shares. But in addition to that, it's also the party's desire to increasingly control everything. That has been the pattern during the Xi Jinping era. That whether it's universities, whether it's the media, whether it's civil society, whether it's private firms, the party wants to have greater influence over what happens to make sure that what these other groups are doing is consistent with the party's own agenda going forward. And for the most part, these were firms that were largely running on their own. Jack Ma himself was a red capitalist. He was a member of the party, as was Pony Ma, or is Pony Ma, who's the head of Tencent. The head of Sohu is a member of the People's Political It's so much easier saying in Chinese. So some of these top level people, very high profile people, are themselves tied with the party, but not always in ways that make them, from the party's perspective, loyal to what they're trying to put forward. So as a consequence, the party's now trying to compel them to not just provide the jobs and the tax revenue and the growth that they used to provide, the party wanted, that benefited from. Now it also wants support for its other types of policy interests. So wants donations to this emerging common prosperity program that's slowly rolling out, and there's firms are being squeezed to contribute to that, make donations to that program, the goal to try and achieve greater equality in a variety of ways. So at what degree the party is still interested in promoting the private sector and having developed for the sector's own interests, as opposed to the party's interests, has now become a greater concern. As a consequence, we're seeing more capital trying to get out of the country. People choosing to move their treasure, their talent out of the country so that the party cannot seize it, have business opportunities outside the party's control. So this is a quiet way of people showing their displeasure or their lack of confidence in the future by getting their capital, in some cases their families, out of the country as a way of hedging their bets about what the future may hold.
I think one of the ironies of the party's antitrust regulatory crackdown is that in many ways the party itself was integral in creating some of these monopolies. If you've ever seen Huawei's sprawling tech campus with these like French chateaus in Shenzhen, well, there was a lot of local government subsidies and tax credits that enabled them to do that because those things are very expensive. But I do want to move on from talking about the private sector and go a little bit deeper into some of these public opinion trends. You already mentioned one of the really startling discoveries in your 2004 survey, which was that farmers in particular were a lot less aggrieved than I think a lot of people in the Western political science academia initially thought they would be, given that when you think about these polarities of inequality trends, they would seem to be the most disadvantaged when it comes to the benefits of reform and opening up. But I'd be curious to know, I know you've done some preliminary sociological survey research in 2023, trying to see how some of these opinions have changed since 2004, 2009, 2014 to today. Are there any results that you're noticing that are of interest that might have changed since your early results?
What a great opening, and it's a good thing he's in my class. He's already seen the slides showing some of this stuff. But again, to emphasize, a number of people criticize me because these three earlier surveys all showed a quite consistent pattern of Chinese citizens not being very angry about the fact that their society was more unequal than it had been in the Mao era. And of course, the Mao era was not very unequal because almost everybody was abysmally poor. But China today, according to some measures, in terms of household income distribution, is more unequal than the United States. I mean, the patterns of inequality in the predictors, particularly the rural urban gap, is very different, but nonetheless. And China today, as you've probably all seen the figures, that China has more dollar billionaires than the US does. Of course, they have a much larger population to potentially produce dollar billionaires. But so the last survey that I did, again, these were using national probability samples of adults, and then face-to-face interviews with collaboration with the Research Center on Contemporary China at Peking University, this is again the Michigan tie from Shen Mingmin, who's been involved in Bruce's surveys. We still found the most recent survey was in 2014, so that's barely at the beginning of Xi Jinping rule. And we know a lot of not necessarily very good things have been happening in China in recent years. And so people kept telling me, you should do another survey, but because we think people are now finally going to be more angry or more pessimistic or whatever. And I said, well, that's nice, but I'm retired now. You have no idea how much work it takes to raise the money to do a national face-to-face household survey and so forth. But sir, by serendipity, I had a conversation barely a year ago at the AAS meetings in Boston with Scott Rosell, who many of you know is a leading China scholar economist at Stanford, who has a lot of research activity focusing on rural China in particular. And he said he has ongoing collaborations with researchers in China, including people who are doing surveys. And if I would select key questions from our 3 national surveys about attitudes toward inequality, he would see if his collaborators in the PRC would include them in their surveys. So, and that worked out. The one major difference, though, is that these are online surveys, not probability sample-based face-to-face surveys. But nonetheless, the collaborators are at the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in Chengdu, and they have been working with Scott for many years on other survey things. And they conducted several rounds of surveys at the end of 2023. And Scott and I and his Chengdu collaborators are now involved in preliminarily analyzing the results of that and trying to standardize, correct for sampling differences so that we can make the answers comparable. And what those studies do in fact show is there has been a quite dramatic change toward more negative attitudes in the key questions that I included, and a whole variety of reasons that people speculated, including me and Scott, that this would be the case. There's the COVID pandemic, zero COVID lockdowns, the sudden lifting of the lockdowns, and maybe 1 million or more people suddenly died within 2 or 3 months at the end of 2022. The youth unemployment problems, the property sector beginning to collapse, and bankruptcy and unpaid loans for big property developers, the falling birth rate, and concern about the population starting to decline in 2022. So I'll just give you a thing. So there are basically 2 kinds of questions that I sent to these collaborators. We have a set of questions that are called attribution questions. You ask people, here are some reasons why some families are poor, and do you think how important do you think each of these explanations is? And then you have another, here are some reasons why some families are rich and other families are poor. And in both of those, there are merit-based explanations. So people are poor or rich depending on how hard they work, how much talent they have, how much education they have. But then there are also societal unfairness factors. So it's unequal opportunities, discrimination, and unfair economic system, dishonesty, and so forth. So, I'm just going to briefly. So here's some brief results for why people in China are poor. An average across the 3 surveys that we directed, the national surveys, the earlier studies, lack of ability. The percentage of the respondents in those 3 surveys that said this is a large or very large influence on why people are poor, lack of ability was 61.3%. In the new 2023 online surveys corrected to make the samples comparable, 31%. So a drop of 30% who thought that people are poor because they just don't have the ability. Lack of effort. In earlier surveys, 58% thought that was a large influence. Now it's 32.9%. Low education, 49.6 in our earlier surveys, 36.9. So clearly a drop. And then if you look at the unequal opportunity, 31% thought that was a large thing in the earlier surveys, 37.6. It has gone up some, not so huge. Discrimination from 23% up to 27.5%. Unfair economic system was 21% only, 35.9%. So there's been a general shift, or more people saying that they thought the reason some people are rich and other people are poor is because of less likely to be due to the variations of merit and more likely to be due to the unfairness and unequal opportunities that prevent people from getting rich. And so they're very similar. I won't read. There's very similar results for why some people are rich. I only read you why some people are poor. But then we also ask a whole series of questions about chances of people getting ahead and how is your family doing? There's a retrospective question in all of our earlier surveys. How is your family doing compared to 5 years earlier? And social surveys love to use what they're called Likert response categories. Much worse, worse, not the same, better, much better, 5-point scale. So this is the sum of the said that my family is now doing better or much better than 5 years ago. In the 3 earlier face-to-face surveys, 69.5%. So a very, very impressive high percentage of people said they were doing better than 5 years ago. In the new surveys, 38.8%. So it's gone down 30% again. Then compared to thinking about 5 years from now, how do you expect your family's economic situation will be 5 years in the future? So optimism about the future. In our 3 earlier surveys, 66.6% said they thought their family would be doing better in 5 years. In the new survey, 47%. So that's dropped 20% basically. And there are a whole bunch of other questions that also tap into the general optimism or pessimism about getting ahead. Here's a statement. Another Likert response is to give somebody a statement and then say, do you strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strong, disagree? Again, those Likert categories. Again, it's a University of Michigan social psychologist, Francis Likert. Anyway, so here's a statement. Hard work is always rewarded. What do you think about that? Is that true? It can't possibly be true. Some people work very hard and they're not rewarded. But anyway, in our earlier surveys, 61.6% of Chinese agree hard work is always rewarded. In the new surveys, 28.3%. So there's been a more than 30% drop in the percentage that's agree with this hypothetical statement. Okay. Another statement, given the current domestic situation, there's still a great opportunity for people like you to improve their standard of living. How do you feel about this statement? Again, the 5 points. The percentage agreeing or strongly agreeing, 58.6% in the earlier surveys, 27.7% now. So we're just starting to write up these results. We haven't done any background analysis, but to compare rural people with urban people by education level, by party membership, and all of those things which we would then do. But it seems to me, assuming that we've done the standardization correctly for the fact that this is online surveys versus face-to-face earlier surveys, shows a striking drop in belief that getting ahead or falling behind is mainly determined by variations in individual and family merit, and a striking decrease in optimism about ordinary families getting ahead and increase in pessimism. And I would think that the Chinese Communist Party should be very worried about the fact that this doesn't quite fit with the idea that China's on the rise and the West is falling and all of those other kind of things, because the earlier Chinese survey results also Chinese in many ways much more optimistic and positive than people in other societies, including the US. But now that seems to have been undermined, and whether this is just a temporary thing, wait, COVID and everything else, or whether it's more a long-term problem, wait and see.
I did want to say that at 11:10, we will be opening the floor to audience questions. So if you'd like to pose a question to Professor Whyte or Professor Dickson, do think about what you would like to say. I have a few more questions that I wanted to ask the both of you. I think going back to some of your interesting results from your earlier surveys from 2004, 2009, and 2014, one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting that you wrote about was how you found that instead of people being aggrieved with these inequalities of income or wealth distribution, there was more of a concern about these inequalities of power. And to give an example so that the audience might understand, the example you gave is how, rural, originally rural, now migrant laborers working in metropolitan areas, they didn't have the same access to public services and utilities than people who were originally from these urban areas. And so this disparity of treatment under the law between different social groups was something that polling-wise seemed to get a lot more concern among those that did your surveys in 2004 and 2009, 2014. But one thing I would like to ask you, Professor Dickson, on this is, in your most recent book, The Party of the People, you have a chapter discussing protest trends from the Reform and Opening Up era. You talk about how, while they're not this, as existential as Tiananmen Square, that actually you see this huge explosion in the frequency and the number of protests that are occurring in China at the national and local level. Well, something I would be curious to ask you about is, when you're seeing this explosion in the number of frequency of protests, does the kind of protests that occur align with what Professor Whyte is finding in his survey results, that really these unfair treatments of certain social groups under the law, this unequal distribution of the law to certain groups, are those the kinds of things that people are protesting about? What do you notice about these kinds of protests?
Preface my answer by saying, what we used to know, or what we thought we knew, may not really apply to the present, because it's very difficult to get the kind of information that we need to analyze trends. It was relatively easy, not too easy, but relatively easier 10 years ago to do field research, to find out people's attitudes, find out about protest activities, the motivations behind it. It's so difficult now to get meaningful data from China and do any kind of extensive field research, that I want to preface my answer with that disclaimer to begin with. But in the recent past, most of the protests were not about issues of political principle or demands for political reform or the need for elections or any of those things. The main source of the main trigger for protests were illegal land grabs, either in the countryside or in the cities, where local officials would confiscate land. The land is owned by the state, but is given in long-term contracts to either to developers or to farmers in the countryside. So local officials would sell the rights to that land to a developer for commercial or industrial development. And as a consequence, the farmers were getting a small share of what the land was actually worth as compensation. So that would trigger a protest to get the fair value of their land. And those kinds of protests had a better chance of being successful. If it's strictly about an economic issue, you didn't get fair compensation for your land, you were laid off or a province severance, but you didn't get it. These kinds of things, local officials would be willing to compromise on because they could use their budgets that they had set aside for what was called stability maintenance to deal with protests. They could use that money to give compensation to the protesters. They were not about larger principles of simply the unfairness of the system, the levels of inequality. They weren't then. But as I was listening to Marty's discussion of the more recent data, one reason that the protests were somewhat limited in the past is that people were generally optimistic about the future. Almost everybody saw their lives getting better, were equally optimistic about the future, and would often be willing to overlook more egregious structural systemic issues. thinking that things were going to get better in the future because they've been getting better up until then. Now that people are less optimistic about the future, the recent past has been more miserable than signs of progress. That undermines what we refer to as the performance legitimacy of the party. The party is no longer delivering the economic benefits that had been prominent throughout most of the post-Mao period. So there may be a level of dissatisfaction now, tinder that can be used to lead to a more disruptive type of protest. That's sheer speculation because we haven't seen those kinds of protests. But the fact that people are less satisfied than they were before may make people more willing to join a protest once it gets started. But that remains to be seen. The main example of a large-scale protest in recent years was either referred to as the A4 protests or the blank paper protests at the end of the COVID lockdowns. But that was such an ephemeral set of protests, very short-lived, limited number of people. It was cracked down immediately, got a lot of attention because it happened so many places almost simultaneously, indicating that level of common grievance and a willingness to act out when the opportunity was there. But also have to recognize it was very small scale, very brief, and the party immediately cracked down on it. Those same grievances may be there for other types of issues that rise in the future. But until we actually are able to send people back into China, scholars abroad to do the kind of field research that we used to be able to do, knowing exactly the propensity for protesting and what motivates people, what reaction the state responds with. A lot of it is just built in a very few cases that may or may not be typical. So as a scholar working on China and not being able to, either by some of the kind of research that Marty's been talking about, the nationwide survey research, which seems to be a thing of the past now, but even the people who would go in and do archival research, to do interviews, it's just getting access to either archives or access to people to conduct interviews has been almost impossible for years, and remains a very difficult place to do the kinds of mundane, boring research that used to be done.
Well, this is quite sad. I still have more questions, but we are at 11:10. So you are now put on notice. If you do not raise your hand, I get more free reign to do whatever I want, but happy to take audience questions now. Yes, gentleman in the front, you mind passing a mic over? And please address if you'd like to ask one professor in particular or ask both.
No, this is for both, or it could be answered by either of you. So I'm doing some research on the topic, but it seems that there's kind of a broad notion amongst certain scholars, especially CCP internationals, that there's some aspects of Chinese culture that kind of yield for more tolerance for kind of this growing inequality, political suppression, and repression of freedom that you found, that Professor Whyte found in his surveys. In favor of more collective economic gain and strong party leadership. Do you think that this is the reason why do you think this contributes, at least why we aren't seeing more disruptive protests, as Professor Dickson outlined? And if not, what do you think is the major cause for not seeing those protests?
I'm always weary about using cultural explanations, and you eliminated other obvious explanations that are easier to track and demonstrate. I think most people, I've never engaged in a protest, and I'm not really afraid of being thrown into prison if I do, or getting beat up if I do. But most people don't protest. So on the one hand, protest is a relatively rare event. There's lots of protests in the US every day in any given year, but most of us don't engage in protests. In the Chinese context, people recognize there's a high price to be paid, potentially, if you do engage in protests, because even though the party is willing to, local officials are willing to pay compensation They also bust heads as a way of warning to other people not to do it again, and so it doesn't spread to other communities. So people who engage in protest recognize you better be prepared to either end up in jail or to be beat up either by the police or the thugs they hired to do their dirty work. So it can be very risky. There may be a cultural element to it, but just given the cost benefit analysis, in authoritarian regimes, you end up having less protests than you do in more open regimes, just because the costs are so much higher.
Just as footnote to that, I again would not reach for cultural explanations. I don't think that's the main thing going on there, although I would like to be able to do this kind of service I did in Taiwan and do a comparison, but I haven't had an opportunity to do that. But I think the main reason that most people have accepted the status quo is, again, refers back to the performance legitimacy that Bruce was talking about earlier. So many people's lives have been improved so substantially and at a much higher rate than in any other society in recent times. You know, if you look at the, attitude polls in America now, do you think the country's on the right track or whatever? And, we have lots of critical attitudes here, and partly because people are much more regularly uncertain about their lives than they've been for decades. But the other part I would say is that within these earlier surveys I did, people didn't say, "Oh, everything's fine." We had a whole set of questions about how fair or unfair do you think the hukou system discriminations are. So how fair is it that it's difficult for migrants in cities to obtain urban household registration? How fair is it not to allow migrant children to enroll in public schools? How, a whole series, and across the board, people were very critical of those. That there's very little, at least in principle, even urban respondents who were the beneficiaries of those restrictions, because they don't have to share so much with the 30 or 40% in large cities of migrants who come in and their children, but they recognize that as in principle, this is just rankly unfair to deprive people of opportunities based upon the accident of their birth or their parents' birth. You could be a kid who spent his entire life in Shanghai, but your parents came from the countryside, so you still have a non-Shanghai hukou, and you're have less privileges and opportunities than a Shanghai urban hukou kid. It just makes no sense. And in our surveys, people don't think, "Oh, that's fine. Let the party do whatever it wants." That's not how they react.
Yes, gentlemen, right there. If you could wait for a mic, someone will be coming. Right here. Samuel, to your left, yeah.
Oh, yes, thanks. I was interested to know that during those white sheet protests during the COVID thing in China, some really brave dissidents got there and put an anti-government banner off of Ridge Rail. You remember that? Did the Stasi ever, Chinese Stasi find out who it was and punish them, or did they get away with it? I wasn't sure. Thanks.
As I recall, excuse me, they did know who put it up, and that person was arrested. But one of the interesting contrasts between dissent and protest in China than elsewhere, to show how much more closed the Chinese political system is. Even when Alexei Navalny in Russia was in prison, he was able to get messages out, get videos out to his supporters. When he showed up in court just a few days before he died, that was available for the news media. When Chinese dissidents go to prison, that's the last you hear about. Their family gets cut off. They don't send messages out to their supporters. So it's the party's willingness and ability to really clamp down on signs of protest is remarkable. A lot of the people who were involved in the A4 protests were not career dissidents. They were just really frustrated with the lockdown. And so when they got picked up a day or two later by the police, it was really scary because they had not encountered that before. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so that was one reason why they didn't snowball from there, because the people who were involved in it were just not the kinds of people who would otherwise be interacting with the security services, and it was very intimidating when it did happen. So that one individual being very brave in doing that, but it's one thing to sort of recognize that individual's bravery, but the fact that it was only one poster on one bridge in one city is also worth noting.
So he never got away with it though, he was punished.
I believe so.
Other questions? Yes, gentleman in the far right. You might see my.
Good morning. Thank you to both of you for your presentation so far, really informative. My question is for the both of you, sort of as the CCP kind of grapples with a declining population within PRC, combined with President Xi's current ideological crackdown and focus, do you think the CCP is going to face a challenge in its ability to maintain power because of a smaller recruiting pool, or is the CCP going to find this new core of people to recruit for the CCP outside of the college students?
Okay. I don't think a declining population, it presents challenges for the party, not in terms of recruiting new members, because you're not targeting, you don't have an equal chance of getting into the party. It's not a catch-all party. They very specifically looking for specific types of people, backgrounds, attributes. For the younger generations, overwhelmingly people are joining for what they see as party membership being beneficial to their careers, whether in working for the party of government or even working for the private sector, even for international firms. For the past 4 or 5 years, the number of people applying to join the party has been going down. Where far back as I can see, each year is getting higher. In the last few years, the numbers have been going down. Why is harder to say. Is it because the number of people getting in has also been going down and people just realize their chance is less and why bother? Or is it because they don't want to belong to the party because they're unhappy with the way things are going? We can look at the trends of the data without knowing what's behind what the motivations are. But I think a declining population, that in and of itself doesn't create challenges for the party recruiting new people, but this general malaise would, because people may be less willing to be associated with a party that's responsible for this malaise.
Other questions? Yes, in the far left over there. Would you someone mind passing a mic, please? Sorry about this. Just bear with us for a moment.
Thanks for me ask the question. Is there some kind of equivalence between the censorship of the COVID lab origin in the US and China? The US documents that are being released show that it was created maybe a joint venture between or subbed out from the University of North Carolina to Wuhan. And would the censorship be because of the potential benefits of synthetic biology and big pharma being a huge business, or would it be legal liability? Jeff Sachs, the economist from Columbia, jeffsachs.org, he has an article. What might the US own if it came out? It came from that. So there's some kind of censorship. I don't know if it's like a collusion maybe between Trump and Xi, or what do you think about the censorship of the lab origin between Ralph Barrett at the University of North Carolina, a student in Wuhan, I can't remember her name, but they called her the bad lady.
You could convert. I haven't read the Jeff Sachs piece, and I don't know what you're talking about, and as far as I know, there's still substantial debates about whether COVID origin in China was due to, spilling out of the market or leak from a lab, and there's still debate about that, and I haven't seen any credible evidence that somehow the US was involved and that that's being censored by somebody, but there clearly is Chinese censorship of Chinese sensitivity about efforts to demand that they be more open about providing data and providing information to allow the world to know how this horrible disease arose. I mean, when Australia, the then Prime Minister in Australia said that China should, allow an investigation of the origins of COVID, China reacted with outrage and slapped trade sanctions. The Australian wine, which they're very proud of down was slapped with a huge penalty that is only just recently, I think in the last week, they lifted and so forth. So the Chinese government is still very sensitive to information, but I don't know anything about it, and would be very skeptical about claims that North Carolina or any other American institution was involved on the initial outburst of COVID.
We have time for probably 2 more questions. Yes, lady on this side of the room.
Hi, so recently I've seen on a YouTube video that after the meeting of the Chinese Communist Party, it's been like the killing month in China now, with like frustrated people just killing randomly innocent people on the road. Like a guy was driving a car into the pedestrians, essentially killing and injuring them, and then a child killing his classmates. And that has been happening a lot around China. So do you think that the CCP may allow some protests to provide a way for the frustrated Chinese to vent their frustration and stabilize the country? Or will they still keep prohibiting protests and let people be frustrated and letting China be unstable? Thank you.
I would imagine in a country of China's size, you have those types of tragic events that happen. Tying it to a political motive, I think, is not. I haven't seen those videos, and the more I hear about these things, the more I'm happy to not be on social media because it just seems to these kinds of details kind of get blown up. There are frequent reports about stabbings, about attacks, about these kinds of tragic events. To lay it, even though the party wants to lead everything, I don't think it leads these types of tragic events. And so what's behind it? Is it really a change of behavior from the past? Or is it just more attention being given to these isolated events? It's hard to know, but there is in a general sense, a willingness to, or had been a tolerance for protests as long as they were peaceful, and what you're describing are not peaceful events. And so for people who engage in protest, they usually stress to their supporters, it has to remain peaceful or else it will not end well for them. So tying those different things together, the specific events that you're talking about are, terribly tragic for the people involved. But unfortunately, they happen with too great an occurrence to just tie it strictly to any type of party policy.
I would just say that, in America, we have these kind of events occurring all the time, and I don't know any comparative study, but I would wager that the American rate of these kind of random, killings and other things by demented people and even demented young people, we probably have a higher rate than China does, so I don't think it's productive to try to say, why is China having these things when they're not distinctive from China, and maybe like feedback less common than American analysis.
I'm being told that we have a question from a Zoom member, is that right? No,
No.
okay, well, we have time for one more question. Yes, lady in the back, in the last row.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So yeah, I have one of the questions from two of those the professors. So I just heard of the the private sectors and how the private sectors in mainland China and collaborated with CCP, because I mean since 1979 before that, and China the economic system, the background is very, very poor. And after that, the chairman Deng Xiaofei, and he developed some of the ideas, just like created the economic cities, just like the Shenzhen city in China, that they're really the economic in China very well. And yeah, I'm very interested about this question. And also, I lived in the United States almost 10 years. I come from Beijing, China. I know some of the CEOs and who running companies in China, but right now they want to get the immigration, the EB-5, the green card, and they told me, some of them, and they told me, they think just like safer the money in the United States is kind of a safer compared to the mainland China in Beijing, and something like that. Thank you so much. My question is how private sector collaborated with CCP, running the system very well since 1979.
Boy, that's a really big, broad question. I'd say early on, the private sector either collaborated or at least had shared interests with the party in promoting economic growth, because much of that was happening in the private sector. And so both the party and private firms were benefiting from that. The party increasingly provided more support, access to export licenses, some degree of access to credit and so on. Since the time of the international financial crisis of 2008-9, there was a big shift towards the party's increasing support for the state-owned sector and less support for the private sector, because the SOEs were more politically important. They were part of the more strategic industries. So since for the past, what is that now, been 15, 16 years, the trend has been the opposite. That in fact, the party is not supporting the private sector as much as it did before. And that's one of the reasons that, as you mentioned, the private entrepreneurs trying to get their capital out of the country as a way of protecting it, because they're not being supported the way they were before. They're not confident that they have the party support in order to protect their financial interest of trying to get their money out of the country. So that in of itself suggests that they're not really confident about either the business opportunities within China going forward or the political protection that they enjoyed in the past. So I think there's a big shift that happened around 15 years ago that has continued to the present.
Well, that's unfortunately all the time that we have for this morning program, but I do want to provide a few announcements for what we'll be doing for the rest of the day. For the next 30 minutes, we will have an interim with a catered lunch where people can meet and greet and chat and hopefully discuss some of the things that we talked about in this conversation. Then starting at noon, we'll start our afternoon programming where we're going to have a book launch of Kang Xiaofei, who's in the religion department. For the gentleman earlier who was asking about cultural trends, you might be interested in this event because the book is specifically talking about how the party has co-opted certain motifs in China's folk tradition to try to advance certain propaganda messages in the 1940s and 1950s. So for people who are interested in that cultural element, I do encourage you to stay for our afternoon programming. We will have more discussion and events during the remainder of this academic term. Please stay tuned for our launch for our inaugural Collegiate Journal of Chinese Affairs, which will be occurring before the end of the semester. And before we close, would you mind thanking our wonderful guests for today for coming?